Thank you so much for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here in Sofia and with our very inspiring opening and speeches. I'm confident this is going to be a great 2 days of discussion and some of the very serious and very pertinent topics that we've already heard about in the introductions. Now, today I'm going to be talking to you about some uncomfortable realities in the context of the debates that we're having today in Brussels and indeed throughout Europe about strategic autonomy. Europe's many dependencies are now openly talked about in ways that they haven't been before. But the reality is that most Europeans still don't understand the degree of their dependence on foreign powers, and on one foreign power in particular. Over the years, Europe has grown increasingly dependent on the US and China, and has struggled to shake off lingering dependence on Russia. But out of those three, only one has troops occupying European Union soil. Only one controls the economic infrastructure of this continent. And only one dominates our TV screens, our radio stations, our magazines, and our movie theaters. And it is this American dependence that is the subject of my new book, The Owned Continents, and also the French edition, Le Continent Captif. Why have I focused specifically on the American dependence, when, as we know, there are other dependencies which Europe has? Well, it's not just because, as you can tell from my accent, I am American by background. It's also because this dependence is the most dangerous and risky one that Europe has today. Our leaders, like European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, like to talk a lot about the problem of Europe's dependencies in vague terms. But she's only willing to name two threats, Russia and China. The third dependence, which is by orders of magnitude larger and riskier, is the dependence that dare not speak its name. For 80 years, European citizens have been sold an illusion of independence. In exchange for Marshall Plan rebuilding and NATO protection following World War II, Western Europeans surrendered a large amount of their sovereignty to the United States. Given the state of destruction that European powers had brought upon themselves in that war, perhaps this Faustian bargain was inevitable. It was certainly understandable. But what is perplexing is why Europe's leaders, even after rebuilding with the economic miracles of the 1960s, have chosen to maintain that same protectorate structure, which in many ways resembles that of vassal states, still today, 80 years later. During the Cold War, in places like here in Bulgaria, Russia's control was brutal and obvious. West of the Iron Curtain, America's control was more subtle, and it was a free choice. As the academic Glyn Morgan argues in his new book, The Rise and Fall of American Europe, which traces how post-war Western Europe was created by and for the United States, he speaks of the Goldilocks treatment. The US allowed just enough independence to not breed resentment, but not so much that it could ever threaten American control. After 1989, Eastern Europe decided to embrace that Western model of American control, for obvious reasons vastly preferring it to the brutality of Soviet control. But this arrangement was always tenuous and risky. Europe put all its eggs in the American basket, and today that basket is collapsing. Donald Trump has exposed not only the degree of America's power over Europe, he has shown how easily the US can extort Europeans by using those dependencies against them. As a journalist based in Brussels, I spent 2025 watching the repeated surrender of Europe's leaders to Donald Trump. in astonishment. Why, I asked, wasn't the EU willing to use the myriad tools at its disposal to fight back against this extortion? There are a variety of factors, but to me, one is very clear. Decades of American cultural domination on this continent have made Europeans unable to see Americans as an adversary, a threat, or a possible enemy. Now, you may be wondering where I'm coming from in making such claims. I grew up in America, but I've lived in Europe the last 20 years. I'm now an EU citizen, and I intend to stay here the rest of my life because life in Europe is better. I emigrated from the United States in order to have a better life. My last job in the US was as a TV correspondent covering the US Congress in Washington in 2005. I saw up close just how dysfunctional the American government had become and how dangerous the US had become to the world. I moved to Europe having read some books about the European Union that described a union emerging as a superpower that could take on or counterbalance the United States. But when I moved here, what I found instead was a collection of vassal states under continued American military occupation. I found a continent that had all the potential to be a superpower, all the tools it needed, but a people that had not yet understood that they needed to use them. Now, that may sound harsh, but the events of the past year have proven it. How else can you explain why European citizens have accepted their leader's repeated surrender to Donald Trump over the past year? The humiliating concessions of President von der Leyen's Turnberry deal signed on Donald Trump's golf course in Scotland. The over-the-top Trump flattery, calling him daddy. The unquestioning acceptance of setting an arbitrary 5% target of military spending at NATO, a level far above even what the United States spends on its military. We know that such groveling to a Russian or Chinese leader would never be accepted by European citizens. So why does it somehow seem normal in the American context? Here's what I think. From the time they're born, Europeans are inundated with American culture. Turn on the radio and you're almost certain to find an American song. Turn on the TV and you'll find an American program. It has been like this for decades. And there's no way that that hasn't had a psychological impact on Europeans. I believe that this has made a vast swathe of the European public subconsciously think that they are in America, or at least on the outer edges of an American empire. And that has made it psychologically difficult to accept that the US could now mean Europe harm. Europeans cannot accept the reality that their own eyes and ears can see and hear because of decades of cultural dominance. In my book, I trace the development of American domination, starting with the rush of Hollywood into European movie theaters following the destruction of World War I, the advent of the Marshall Plan and NATO following World War II, which involved an implicit acceptance of American control over economic and military affairs, all the way to the emergence of the American tech giants, controlling our daily lives starting in the 2000s. But it's not all doom and gloom. In the final section of my book, I lay out 6 essential steps to liberate Europe from American dependence. And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, these steps are not just to liberate Europe from American dependence, but also from Chinese and Russian dependence, which are, as I say, less severe, less risky, but still a great, great worry for this continent. Europe should endeavor to be free from all 3, to be an independent, sovereign actor that can take care of itself, and Europe has all the tools to do so. First off, we have to take the problem of American cultural domination seriously. To some people, it may seem trivial, After all, what's the harm in listening to Beyoncé or going to the movie theater and watching Superman? But there is a harm. There is a harm in having your everyday life defined by a foreign power's culture. And there's especially a harm when Europeans consume only two types of culture, their own and America's. This is difficult because we can't force Europeans to watch the content of their neighbors, to watch European content. But we have to find a way to get Europeans interested in the culture and news from their neighboring countries, rather than having American culture and news be the only one they know, other than their own. Open up any national newspaper on this continent and you will see two types of news, domestic and American. News about the European Union is hard to find. News about the politics of neighboring countries is even harder to find. The irony is, the EU founders dreamed of a common European culture, but they didn't know where to start. They were politicians. It wasn't something they knew. The irony is that we now do have a common European culture. It's American culture. An Italian and a German don't know anything about each other's pop stars or TV shows or news, but when they come together, they can talk about American culture. They talk about Superman, Beyoncé, Stranger Things, and they talk about Donald Trump. Almost all Europeans know more about American politics than they do about their neighboring countries' politics, or certainly EU politics. Many younger Europeans who get their news from American social media even know more about US politics than their own country's politics these days. That is a problem, because it means they're focusing on America's preoccupations, American culture wars, American politics, rather than focusing on their own European issues. Again, this weird subconscious feeling I've heard from Europeans over the past 2 decades that they somehow think they're part of America. And that brings me to the next essential steps. We must fix this continent's broken education systems. The reason Europeans don't know about EU politics is that their education systems never taught them even the basics of EU civics. Europeans are taught the EU as history, as a historical development, but they aren't actually taught how it works, how a bill becomes a law. As an American, it was very shocking to me because this is something we learn at a very young age, around the age of 14, in a class usually called social studies. Now, the problem is that if Europeans aren't taught anything about how the EU works, which is their confederal level of governance, then how can we ask them to vote in EU elections? How can we ask them to know what's going on or to feel any sense of agency in the laws that are being crafted in Brussels, which are being crafted through a democratic process? These are not bureaucrats deciding things in an unelected manner. These are elected national government representatives and directly elected members of the European Parliament. The problem is that citizens don't know anything about what they're doing because they've never been taught. It would be a bit like an American growing up in Texas and having their school system teach them only about what the Texas state government does and ignoring Washington as if it doesn't exist at all. And studies have shown that the proportion of laws that impact an individual's daily life are about similar in the United States and Europe when you look at the state level and the federal level, or in Europe's case, the member state level and the confederal level. Now, this problem of a lack of knowledge continues into lifelong learning, what Europeans get from their news media as adults. European news media does a horrible job covering the European Union because journalists and their editors are victims of the same education systems that their readers are victims of. They also don't know even the basics about it. And EU countries allow coverage of the EU, when it exists, to be dominated by Anglo-American news outlets. News outlets like The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, The Financial Times. They allow them to set the narrative. which is then repeated by national editors who only monitor news from their own country, the US and the UK, because they are likely only fluent in two languages, their own and English. Now, we saw this play out during the COVID pandemic, when national media in continental Europe started writing about a vaccine disaster, a media narrative that was spun in the United Kingdom, where people were desperate for an early Brexit win. In reality, there was not a vaccine disaster. Continental Europeans got their vaccines only slightly later than people in the US or the UK. But reading continental media, which were getting their cues from British media and American media, you would have thought there was one. And in the end, when there wasn't a vaccine disaster, we never got a mea culpa from the European media. We never got an analysis about why the narrative spun so out of control. Now, I made the analogy of Texas and the US federal government, and when I do, that sometimes makes people wince. They're two completely different things, people will say. But any social scientist will tell you that the EU is already a confederation, even if it's constantly referred to by European media as a trade bloc. The EU has a legislature that makes laws. It has a high court. It has many of the hallmarks of a federation, like the US, Canada, Switzerland, Austria, or Germany, with the notable exception of not having a single foreign and defense policy and having no federal-level taxation. I believe that it should. I have always identified as a federalist, something I had to keep quiet about back when I was working at The Economist, but was nonetheless true. Europe can only achieve sovereignty through EU federation, and I devote a chapter to this in my book. There is no other path to autonomy. And for those who recoil at the F word, I would ask them to explain how else Europeans can be sovereign and free from the domination of global superpowers. I've never heard them even try. I've never heard an alternative suggested. I hear often from Europeans that federalism is a pipe dream, that Europeans are so different from one another that they could never possibly be together in a union. They say the idea of a United States of Europe is flawed because Europe doesn't have the same common language and culture that America has. And yes, there are differences between the different parts of Europe, but zoom out to a global level and you'll see that Europeans have far more in common with one another than they think. There is a European culture. There is a European way of life. It is different from other parts of the world, and it is different from America. This is a point I cannot stress enough. Americans are different from Europeans. Europe is not America. The term United States of Europe is probably leading people to the wrong comparison. A better comparison is India. India is a union of different states which historically were all separate. Different languages, different cultures, different races. They were brought together by British imperialism, and when they kicked the British out of the subcontinent, they could have chosen to go back to being a bunch of European-sized, small, princely states based entirely around language and culture. The nation-state model of Europe. Instead, they chose to build a large, independent, sovereign union. Why? Because they had seen how the British were able to divide and conquer small, disunited states. They had seen how those princely states had, over the course of 2 centuries, become first protectorates, then vassals, then directly part of a British empire. They knew that to be important in the modern world, they had to put their differences aside. They too feel very different from one another, just like Europeans. But to us here in Europe, we don't generally know the differences between the different peoples of India. We think of them all as being simply Indian. But India is a union of 28 states with 24 different official languages, exactly the same number as the European Union. And Hindi, the lingua franca of India, is understood by only a little more than half of the population, the same proportion of EU citizens who understand the lingua franca here in Europe, English. India, and also Indonesia, show the benefits that come with being a multilingual, multi-ethnic union. In the book, there's also a chapter on flexing Europe's economic muscle. Europe has all the tools it would need to be able to say no to Donald Trump's extortion, but it chooses not to use them. Why haven't governments and banks signed up to the European Payments Initiative, which would prevent Donald Trump from turning off Europeans' ability to pay each other with Visa or MasterCard overnight? Why is Germany blocking the use of the anti-coercion instruments against the US to protect it from Donald Trump's extortion? Why is France blocking the diversification of the EU's trade partners? Why is Italy blocking discussions on using the EU's tariff bazooka against US services imports? Because Europeans haven't had the courage and the confidence to use the strengths that they possess. I also call for an EU army. And I say how the failure to create it is another example of Europe failing to use the strengths it has. A pooled European military would be as large as America's and 10 times the size of Russia's. But efforts to create this have been blocked by this continent's Atlanticist establishment for many years, for fear of undermining NATO. Now, NATO at this point is a paper tiger, just as Donald Trump said. He is, after all, the only one who decides whether NATO is a paper tiger or not. So if Trump tells us NATO is a paper tiger, we have to take him at his word. And so we need to develop an alternative, urgently. It is clear there is no longer US Article 5 protection of Europe. I write in the book that Europe clinging to the NATO fantasy, a delusion exemplified by Secretary General Mark Rutte, is preventing the development of real solutions to give Europe military sovereignty. I also point out that the EU army idea is very badly understood by the public in Europe. We're not actually talking about one unified blob army. That most probably wouldn't work. We're talking about something like the US National Guard, something I find most Europeans actually don't know about. Each state in the US, each of the 50 states, has their own military. They're confusingly named the National Guard. There's nothing national about them. They are under the control of each state governor. You may have seen there's controversy about this with Donald Trump trying to commandeer some of those state militaries for his own use to use against other states. Now, those militaries can be coordinated by the federal government, by the president, in foreign wars. They often are. I have family members in the National Guard who have served in Iraq and Afghanistan, but at the end of the day, they are actually under the control of each state governor. That's the type of thing that we're talking about when we talk about an EU army. And if this concept was more clearly explained to the public, I think you would find public support for this would be in the majority. Finally, the last step I outline in the book is that Europeans must believe in themselves. I tell the story of visiting my relatives in Italy and hearing them curse the fact that their great-grandmother, the sister of my great-grandfather who emigrated to the US, stayed in Italy rather than going to America. They thought life in America is much better than life in Italy, a notion I strongly pushed back on. One said that today's Europeans are the descendants of people who were too scared or too lazy to leave. I disagree, but I've heard this attitude expressed so many times in Europe. If Europeans are scared, passive, or cautious, it's a result of the trauma of World War II, in my opinion, something that came after the period of mass emigration. But Europeans hear one message their whole lives. America is big, bold, and beautiful, while Europe is old, tired, and lame. We need to change that narrative. We need to foster a European pride, mindful of the horrific mistakes of the past, but moving on, learning from that, and creating a European civic nationalism. We can't keep ceding the emotion of pride and patriotism to the far right. We need to offer Europeans a continental patriotism. We need to define what being European is, in contrast to Europe's enemies. We need to explain why Europe is not America, and why that is a good thing that Europeans should be proud of. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Thank you for your speech. So I'm sure that there are many questions and that you would, yes, of course. So could you please first tell your name and the institution that you are coming from? So I think, Paul, you were the first. Would you like question by question or several questions?
Question by question is easy.
Okay, question by question. So please, Paul.
Yes, my name is Paul Rübig, Group 1 in Economic and Social Community. You mentioned services, which are so important for all of us. And now with artificial intelligence, of course, data will play a key role. We now decided on the ESG, environmental social governance, where we, free of charge, put all our data to United States, to the big consultants, and they can use it to bring European companies in other parts of this world. What do you think could we do in data ownership, in licensing our data, creating income for the one who will develop intellectual property or knowledge-driven society, and could we organize it by blockchain and by reverse cookies to get also taxation out of this? So it's not tariffs, it's taxation on income in a compulsory licensing system. Do you think that's possible?
Yes, I do think that's possible. I think there's two simultaneous concerns here. So one is that if we are sending our data from Europe to the United States, we can lose access to that data with the flip of a switch, the so-called kill switch. And this concern was heightened last week or the week before when the US government blocked Anthropic from allowing Europeans to use its latest models. That highlighted this whole kill switch concern. And then, of course, the other concern is just the fact that we're sending data. I mean, there is a reason why GDPR and other pieces of EU legislation were trying to get a hold of how much data was flowing over to the United States and trying to get that data on European servers. The problem is we don't have the servers, right? So we have to be able to build those servers. That requires private investment. That's going to require private companies to come up and do that. The difficulty is, how do you scale those companies? Now, I think to some people it may not seem immediately related, but capital markets union, which the EU has been trying to do for so long, is so essential for this. And I write about this a lot in the book. It is so difficult for European startup companies to get capital on this continent because of the fragmented nature of the investment markets. They have to go over to the US. So there are clear private sector solutions that need to be made here in order to just get the servers, but there also has to be legislative solutions that make it a legal requirement for data to be stored here. Now, we just had the Supreme Court rule on the oversight body in the United States. We were waiting for this decision because of Max Schrems's lawsuit. Basically, there was this compromise reached where the US government set up this body to say, okay, the US is going to have the same privacy legislation as exists in Europe, so there's this equivalence now, and the data can flow over to the US. Well, now the Supreme Court has very clearly said, no, there is not equivalence, there is not a neutral oversight board. This is so obviously not equivalent to EU legislation. It will be up to the European Commission, it will be up to President Ursula von der Leyen to do something about this. I personally don't have great confidence that she will, but it is the Commission's duty to uphold EU law and to uphold the treaties, and if she doesn't, it will be a flagrant violation of that, and she will be refusing to uphold EU law. So lots of things to watch there, but the short answer would be we need private capital, we need EU legislation, and we need a European Commission who is willing to defend EU law. And at the moment, I don't have very much confidence that under President von der Leyen, we have that.
Thank you, Dave. I believe, yes, the gentleman in the 7th row. Please, the microphone here.
My name is, does it work? Yeah. My name is Mio Soric. I'm working with Deutsche Welle. And I really try not to be too polemic right now, because my perspective, can you? Okay. Does it work now? All right. So I've been in America for 8 years, bureau chief in Washington, so I know what I'm talking about. And I've been in Moscow for many years, a correspondent, so I know very well what's happening there. My German perspective, I'm born and raised in Germany, is completely different, because there would be no Germany without America. The Germany that we know right now is only working because of American troops there. No reunification, no prosperity, nothing of that would be possible without America. I can go over and over again that from what you said, the threat seems to be America and not Russia, not China. And this is the core thing that I completely disagree. But you said many times that we have to become European nationalists. I'm completely against nationalism. I think patriotism is okay, but nationalism would be bad. But my question to you is very, very simple, and you can answer very briefly on that. How you would counter Russian threat now, today, not in a month, in a week, as NATO, as a Baltic state, as Poland, as Germany, without America. Very simple, now, not in a year, not 10 years. Ammunition in Germany is enough for 1 day, If Russia would start its threat, it would make it real. Just go for a day trip to Estonia. We couldn't do anything. So my question to you is, how would you counter Russia's threat now, in a day or two?
Okay, thank you.
To use an expression from New England, where I come from, if I was going there, I wouldn't start from here. Obviously, we're not able to defend Europe from a Russian invasion if it happens tomorrow. And that I don't disagree with you with. Look, the United States was deeply involved in drafting the Constitution for Germany. The United States in many ways created post-war Germany. And Germany is dependent on the United States, no disagreement there. The question is, why? Why are we here? Why did we allow this? Why did we allow ourselves to get to this situation? I'm answering your question. So the answer to that question is, right now, we are just hoping that Article 5 exists. We are entirely reliant on whether Donald Trump would decide to defend European countries if we were invaded by Russia tomorrow. Now, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But is this a comfortable situation that we're in right now, where we're entirely dependent on his whims? What would I do to defend Europe? Well, we'd have to just wing it. I mean, it would be chaos. That's my answer. But never have I said that Europe is ready to do this tomorrow. The point is, if you don't start somewhere, then it'll never get done. We should have started this 20 years ago. We should have started this 10 years ago. But the fact that we can't do it right now is not a reason not to try. We have to start from somewhere. And even if it may be too late, it's only too late if Russia invades in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. I mean, it's going to take a while to build European defense. Yeah, it could be as much as 10. But again, that's not a reason not to start. And building European defense is not contradictory to NATO. This is an old red herring that Atlanticists have liked to put forward, that you would undermine NATO by building European defense. You can have a NATO of 2 pillars. You could have NATO as an actual alliance between Europe and America. But right now, we have no European side of that pillar. We have America and then everyone else. But it's under an American command and control structure, under that NATO structure, which can't work without the United States. So what I would do is, if I was in charge of Europe, if I was Ursula von der Leyen right now, and Russia invades tomorrow, I would beg and plead and hope that the United States is going to defend this continent because that's our only option, thanks to the very bad decisions taken over the past decades by Atlanticist leaders on this continent. Are we going to keep making those mistakes, or are we going to course correct? That's the question.
Thank you, Dave. Any more questions? Yes, Florian, please.
Thank you so much.
Morning. Sorry.
Please, no, please.
Repeating microphone.
Morning, Michel Jeffrey Plumley. You were referring to the domination of American culture in Europe and the jump to the Hollywood world and the references. Sorry. Working. And after World War I. So I'm an Englishman, but I'm a Frenchman as well. How would you comment on the French exception culturelle on the cinema first, and very shortly, of course, because we haven't got time, about the slightly different approach of the French in defense policy, including with a reference to what President de Gaulle and, in another way, President Macron are trying or have tried to make it slightly different, a little bit on the margin of the American influence and power dominion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, on the first question, actually, there's a whole chapter on the Tuban laws in France in the book. I think it's had limited success. So certainly, if you look at France, it is one of the least culturally dominated by America countries in Europe. Generally, there is a south on one hand, north and east on the other hand, split on this. So the countries of Southern Europe tend to be the least culturally dominated. If you look at the percentage of American music on the radio, American programs on TV, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, interestingly, tend to be the least dominated, whereas Northern Europe, Netherlands, has some of the highest. 90% of movies in movie theaters in the Netherlands are from the United States. So they have the highest rate of cultural penetration. I think that the French linguistic quota, so these are the percentages that every radio station has been obliged to play a certain percentage of French music and show a certain percentage of French culture. It's been somewhat successful, but I'm skeptical of quotas in general because I think that in France, what this has ended up producing is kind of a lot of low quality music, let's say just to take the music case, that's just used to meet the quota. And I think you can kind of feel it when you're listening to French radio that there is a bit of quota filling going on. And also when you look at the percentages for France versus neighboring large countries, Germany, Italy, it's not that France is so much higher in terms of having its own domestic cultural export. It's one of, if not the highest in Europe, so certainly the quotas have worked, but I don't think they've had the level of success that Minister Toubon, for instance, would have wanted when these were all codified and brought together in 1992. On the second question in terms of, I mean, look, I think France is having a moment, kind of an I told you so moment right now, that, you know, we hear a lot in Brussels. De Gaulle was right. In terms of France warning about over-reliance on the United States, about not building European sovereignty, France was pushing for European defense to be part of the EU Constitution when it was being drafted in 1999. The US Defense Secretary put an end to that when he came in and commanded there will be no EU caucus of NATO. The French, unfortunately, did not have allies to push against that, and that's what I write in the book. France was right all this time. But France needs to ask itself, why did no one listen to them? Why were they somehow not convincing? Why did they not have allies in this argument? I think that's a tough question, which goes a bit to failure to accept linguistic realities, but also a political culture in France that is quite inward-looking, in my opinion. And didn't make enough of an effort to convince other Europeans of their argument. There was almost an assumption that the argument is so right that we don't need to bother convincing anyone else of its rightness. I hope that this is a lesson that France is learning now, because people should have been listening to France all this time, and they should be listening to them now, and they should be listening to President Macron.
Thank you, Dave. So we are going to take one more question, Florian, but Dave is going to be with us during the coffee break and later on. So all the questions, all the comments that you have, you can approach him and discuss later as well. So Florian Marin, member of Workers' Group, European Economic and Social Committee. So you don't have to introduce yourself now.
Thank you, Maria. Well, I will be brief. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I think that it was quite comprehensive and quite good. I have two questions. How do you see the role of the market in shaping the future EU culture? Because we are addressing the market quite differently in Europe if we are comparing with US. And the second question is, since the situation is very different after the World War II, what do you think about the new Bretton Woods in relation with dollar? And of course, the relation with IMF. We have saw the impact of IMF after the financial crisis in 2011. Thank you so much.
Thanks. So on the first question was again, sorry, short term. Yes.
All the market.
Exactly. So look, from the Draghi report, it is clear that the single market has not been completed, right? That this is again what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Europe's potential that hasn't been met. The problem, as I see it, is that the failure to complete the single market is not a Brussels problem. It's a Paris problem, it's a Berlin problem, it's a Sofia problem. It's the national governments that have had the short-term thinking instinct to protect their own power, to protect their own way of doing things in individual countries, and that has inhibited the development of the single market. But the problem is now we get this narrative from politicians, national politicians. The easiest lever for a national politician to pull is blame the EU. It's Brussels' fault. It's those Brussels bureaucrats. The reason why we're having economic problems in Europe is because of those Brussels bureaucrats and the EU causing red tape and bureaucracy. The reality is the EU doesn't cause red tape and bureaucracy. National governments cause red tape and bureaucracy by gold-plating EU laws and by blocking further advancement of the single market and knocking down the barriers between EU member states, which were supposed to have already been knocked down by now. So it's extremely urgent that we deal with this. But what worries me is that in the European Council summits, which I cover always in Brussels, we have Friedrich Merz coming in there and saying he's on a crusade against EU red tape, not acknowledging at all that the failure to complete the EU market is Berlin's fault and other national capitals. So as long as we have people like Merz and Maloney coming into the two most powerful leaders in that council at the moment, as long as we have them coming in and blaming everything on the EU, it's a misdiagnosis of the problem, and I don't see President von der Leyen urgently confronting this issue of a failure to complete the single market. Now, I really hope that we can make some progress, at least on Capital Markets Union. I cannot stress enough how important that is. If there was just one low-hanging fruit thing that we could do, I would say it's that, and European Payments Initiative. But, and also, so to your second question about the post-war economic infrastructure, we have to be very conscious of the fact that it is not just the American military protectorate that we rely on here in Europe. We also rely on the bedrock of American economic infrastructure, the entire economy that we've built here in Europe, which has been a very successful one, but it relies on American infrastructure. And if that American infrastructure goes away, even before all of the cloud dependence that we have now, we're screwed. So if President Trump decides to flick the kill switch, he can literally turn off our economy tomorrow. Now you could ask, is that ever realistic? Because that's also suicide for the United States. You would blow up the world economy if you did that. But the fact that it's a possibility is very, very unnerving. And so we need to be moving forward with these efforts to build our own European economic infrastructure for our economy to rely on, so that no foreign power has the ability to extort us with the threat to turn the whole thing off, to turn parts of it off. We need to be able to get rid of that threat because it is such a vulnerability. And again, these things are hard. Altogether, the challenge is very, very daunting. And I think some people are in denial of the problem because the challenge is so huge that they want to pretend the problem doesn't exist. We need to be truthful and honest about the problem as it exists. And we need to think about what we can do. And it will be hard. I mean, the challenge is huge. We are nowhere near where we should be right now, thanks to decades of mistakes. But like I say, we have to start somewhere, we have to start now, and we have to believe in ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. Thank you for this keynote speech. Thank you for answering questions. I believe, I'm sure, that there will be more questions and more comments in the time during the break and after. So thank you.
Thank you very much.